The Clinton Road.
Hey everyone, I've been hearing stories and finally decided to post my encounter, as I'm kind of new to this. I hope you enjoy it. I used to ghost hunt with friends, so I have a few stories. Here's the first one. Very long, but worth it. This was a couple of years ago. I was still in college, working at my local high school in South Jersey on the night shift to make some extra money, but unfortunately the hours meant I couldn't really have a life during the week. I got a call from my group of friends on a Friday before work saying they were going to explore Clinton Road, which was known to be the scariest road in New Jersey. Obviously I couldn't go, so I told them to let me know how it went. Later in the evening, I got a panicked call from them saying that a bunch of crazy stuff happened to them. They described what happened to them, how they threw coins over the Ghost Boy Bridge and coming back, a ghost truck followed them and the feeling of being watched. I thought they were just exaggerating because I missed it, so it was decided that we would all go the next night. But this time, I got to see it for myself, something I would regret for the rest of my life. Since we are from South Jersey, Clinton Road is a bit far for us, about 2 hours, so there was plenty of time to get excited and scared. Now I can only describe myself as the manly man of the group. I am 6 feet 5 inches and 270 pounds. Especially back then, I had the personality of, everything is made up, nothing will scare us. Boy, was I wrong. Just when we arrived, the whole atmosphere changed and felt heavy. We all thought, this is pretty creepy, one of those times when you don't see anything but you sense there's something wrong with that place. The road is in the middle of the forest. The houses are few and far apart. The first thing we see when we arrive is a small building that looks like a mini castle, is the best way to describe it. And because of the distance between the two, we all had to pee. So I went left, friend 2, Joe, went straight, and friend 3, Har, went right. Friend 4 was a woman who stayed behind us on the road. After I finished, I walked back with my friend Har right away, but we noticed Joe walking towards the creepy building. I started yelling at him and asked him what he was doing, and he turned around with a surprised expression. I was completely confused. I asked him what he was doing walking over there. Joe swore over and over that I was behind the building, waving him over. Follow me to the building. So naturally, we all freaked out and stayed silent for a second. We stopped at the Ghost Boy Bridge and we all checked ourselves for coins to make sure they didn't do it just to scare me. We all threw the coins away, nothing happens. I said, guys, it's all in your heads. Let's go. So we all started walking back to the car. Cling, cling, cling. I hear the coins falling on the road. We run back to check and find the coins lying on the road. I was 100% convinced that my friends were playing a prank on me. So I came up with the idea of marking a coin so they couldn't counterfeit it. I threw the coin in the water, waited 5 minutes in silence. Nothing. Then I said, come on guys, let's go. There's nothing. Cling, cling, cling. I hear coins on the road. I walk back. I pick one up. And it was a coin with the exact same markings I put on it. At this point, I was really scared, so we decided to leave. Driving down the windy road in a sports car, we were all scared and just wanted to leave. We saw headlights appear behind us seemingly out of nowhere. We didn't see them attached to a vehicle. I'm not a car expert, but I bet my life that they were the lights of an old pickup truck. The faster we went, the closer we were to the lights, taking turns at speeds that even a new pickup truck couldn't handle. Suddenly, the lights disappeared. So now, all panicked, we decided to stop to map out the exit. It was so quiet it was like a graveyard. No lights except our headlights in the woods. We heard the typical moaning of women ghosts, and of course what came with it was the typical woman in a white dress standing in the woods right next to our car and letting out the loudest scream I've ever heard in my life. At that point, we were all screaming to get out of there. Once we got back to the main roads, we decided to head a little further down this road. Apparently, the ghost truck tries to make people crash at the Devil's Bend, as numerous bodies of the famous serial psychopath, the Iceman, have been buried there. On the way home, we were so brave that we wanted to go back the next night, Sunday. We suddenly passed an old, run-down church that looks like it hasn't been used in 50 years. And of course, the sign at the entrance that said, "You need Jesus on Sunday." It's safe to say I never went back. And even to this day, the group of friends still refuse to talk about what happened that night on Clinton Road.
The doppelganger of my granddad. Let me start off by saying that I'm not very knowledgeable about YouTube or most websites in general. I'm not very good with computers, but my nephew is a little younger than me and he told me that this story should be posted somewhere on the internet, so he's going to help me tell it and all that. Anyway, I wanted to share a story that my grandmother, or grandma if you prefer, used to tell me this scary story. When I was very young, and even dumber than I am now, I used to believe almost everything my grandmother told me, and she would tell me a lot of things that she probably shouldn't have told me. She was a very religious woman, and she loved to try to scare me and my sister with stories of beings and creatures and other evil things to make us be good and behave, but she would always tell a story that didn't fit in with the others. The funny thing is that I've never heard the story anywhere else except from her, so it would be nice to post it online for others to hear. Anyway, she used to swear that there was some sort of entity or other nasty thing that could disguise itself as someone else. She said it wasn't very good at it though, and you could always tell something wasn't right. Now my nephew told me about skinwalkers and stuff like that, and he said this might be a bit similar, but I think there are some pretty big differences. First of all, my grandmother said that whatever that thing was, it wasn't human in the slightest. It wasn't some sort of witch or anything, just something completely different. She told me that she didn't know what it really looked like either, under that disguise and all. She told me that after her second husband passed away, about 2 weeks after the funeral, there was a knock on her door in the middle of the night in the middle of winter during a nasty snowstorm. She said she opened the door and there was Javier, her second husband. She said that at first she thought it was him, but after he walked into the light of the house, she knew something wasn't right with him. She told me he looked sagoglan, which means oddly built or hunched over. I didn't know what that word meant back then, though, so that became the name of the thing. She said the first thing she didn't like was that his eyes were a little far apart, not to an extreme degree, but enough that you could tell. Then she said his skin was a lot smoother and less wrinkled than when he passed away. He was almost 90 years old, and she said he looked at least 10 years younger that night. She got really anxious when she started noticing all these things that didn't add up, and then she added the fact that she buried him 2 weeks earlier, and she started to panic. She said Javier put both his hands up and started to tell him, "Don't worry, honey," but his voice wasn't right either. She said he sounded like it hurt to talk, like there was a moan behind his voice, and his lips didn't match up either. She told my brother and I that it started to look more like someone had put on a bad Javier mask and was wearing it around. She says she'd never been more scared in her entire life, so she started pushing it and hitting it with both fists. And that woman was very aggressive, so I'm sure she made it back off. She said its skin was cold when her hands touched it, but it was cold that night and snowing heavily, so I guess that makes sense. After she hit it a bit, the thing took a step back and started making noises she'd never heard before. She said it was like a low growl or a moan, and she compared it to an old, heavy door opening very slowly. She always tried to make the noise herself and got choked up. Anyway, she closed the door and said the thing just stood there for about an hour before it went back into the woods. She lived in a valley about 30 miles from any town, and her neighbors were all snowed in like she was, so she couldn't call for help. He said that that night he had been more afraid than ever. He told us that the thing is not always the same person, but can change and wear new disguises when it wants to. He said that was the only time he had ever seen it, but he had heard stories from his own mother. The funny thing is, a month before my grandmother passed away, I went to the gas station on my way home from work very late. When I walked in, there was a guy at the counter all stiff. The cashier was asking him to move, so he could help me, but the guy wouldn't move. Finally, the guy turned to me and I got a good look at his face. His skin was like rubber and looked fake, and I couldn't really tell where his eyes were looking, as they almost looked like two marbles, dry and not wet like a normal eyeball. After paying for the gas, the guy followed me without saying a word. I felt very uncomfortable, but at first I thought he was just someone down on his luck, but when I got back in my truck, I approached him and asked if he needed help. He looked at me with those dry-looking eyes and said, "All right," in that same clipped voice my grandmother used to tell us about. I told her that story at the hospital the next night, and she put her finger on my forehead and said, "Now you've seen it too." And I felt very strange. Maybe that guy at the gas station was the Sagoglan like my grandma said, but he didn't dress like Javier that night, so who knows. Anyway, I hope you liked this little story. It has always given me chills, and maybe this is a good time to tell it to others.
My ghost of my mother-in-law saved me. Years ago, I lived outside Buffalo, New York, on an old estate on the shores of Lake Erie. I rented the carriage house of an old mansion that belonged to a doctor and his wife. The doctor was a heart surgeon, and they were a wealthy couple with several properties, so they weren't around very often. I liked the solitude of the place, since I had just gotten divorced, and although the carriage house was a little decrepit, I loved living there. The mansion faced the lake, and my house was closer to the road, off a private road that ran from one side of the estate to the other. The carriage house had been the servants' quarters for those who lived in the mansion in the early 20th century. There was an enclosed courtyard outside my door that was bordered by the back of my house, the carriage barn, which had stored carriages back in the days of horses and buggies, a row of empty horse stables, and a brick wall with an entrance to the courtyard. It was a very nice place to live. Rent was cheap, and there was a 150-foot private beach that almost no one used except me. But it was very secluded if no one was staying at the mansion, and there were no nearby neighbors because all the houses along the road were large estates, and a lot of the rich people who lived in the area weren't full-time residents. But I was young and brave, and it was a large estate full of decaying ghosts, and I'm a weirdo who likes that sort of thing, so I was very happy to find the place. One night, I was coming home late, around 1 a.m. from a friend's house. Driving down a street a mile or two from my house, I saw a dark figure up ahead, standing near the road. I thought it was a little odd because it was late at night on a weekday, not exactly party time in the town south of Buffalo. I started to get a little nervous because the person was standing there like they were waiting for someone to pick them up, and as I got closer, I could see they were wearing a strange black shroud-like thing, long and dark and
El
draped,
fantasma
with
de
part
mi
of it
suegra.
wrapped over the person's head to look like a hood. Similar to someone wearing an abaya and hijab, only much looser, like a bunch of fabric just wrapped around someone's body. It seemed totally inappropriate for what I knew of people who lived in the area to see someone wearing something like that, and certainly not outside at 1 in the morning on a weekday. The person was standing on the side of the road, looking hunched over and old. I slowed to a crawl as I approached, worried that the person needed help. Maybe it was a senile senior citizen who had wandered out of their house in the middle of the night. Confused? When I got close enough to get a good look at the person, she lifted her head and looked in my direction, and I saw that it was my ex-mother-in-law. I was absolutely sure it was her. Same grayish-brown hair, same eyes, same enigmatic smile that had always made me wonder what she was thinking, but never said. She raised her hand and waved at me. It wasn't a stop and help me gesture, but more of a nice to see you gesture. I freaked out. My mother-in-law had passed away 3 years before I drove down that road. I sped up and drove on, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. But after a few minutes and a few deep breaths, I told myself I should go back and take another look. My mother-in-law had loved me. I couldn't imagine that her ghost would show up looking to get revenge on me for divorcing her son, who hadn't treated me well, to say the least. I turned into a plaza, turned left, and went back down the same street, but there was no one there. I was too scared to go back to my creepy garage with the strange sounds and the 100-year history, with no one but me and the ghosts I was convinced probably inhabited the place. So I drove to the local all-night Greek restaurant and sat there for an hour drinking coffee and calming my nerves. When I finally drove home and entered the yard, I could see that something was wrong. My door was open. The window panes were broken. The door was cracked almost completely from one side to the other. Someone had destroyed the door to get into the house. The next day, I found a crowbar in the yard, lying to the side. The only things I noticed missing from the house were a few items of my clothing, super creepy, a jar of loose change, and a knife from the kitchen. I was just divorced and not exactly rich. I didn't have much worth stealing. It's really scary when someone breaks into the house you live in alone and in an isolated location. They must have broken in the yard, and they wouldn't have been seen while they were breaking down the door. I called the police. They never caught anyone. As upset as the robbery was, it wasn't until hours later that I remembered seeing my dead mother-in-law waving at me from the side of the road. I felt like the Grim Reaper. I'm convinced that she somehow showed up to delay my return home. That if I had driven straight into the garage, whoever the person or people were who had broken my solid, 100-year-old wooden door practically in half with a crowbar, they could have been waiting for me there, or I could have surprised them. And that things could have turned out very differently, perhaps very badly for me. I write fictional horror stories now. I even wrote an entire novel of ghost stories. But this story is 100% real, from real life. I swear on my ex-mother-in-law's grave that it really happened. You could even say that seeing Mom on the side of the road that night is part of the reason I write scary stories. So my recommendation is for people to remember to be kind to their mothers-in-law. She might help them even after she's deceased. It's a trap. As late teens, almost in our 20s, growing up in South Jersey, my group of friends would always go out ghost hunting on the roads and abandoned buildings around New Jersey. We always had crazy experiences, and this is one of them. One night, thinking about what to do, we decided to go on a little ghost hunting trip around our area. Everyone knew that our group of friends was the one that always got into this kind of stuff, so we always got advice from other friends outside the group on what places to go. We were advised to do a little haunted route not too far from us, and we decided why not? It's better than nothing. So we jumped in the car and started the trip down the road. On the way, we stopped to shop at a Wawa, at which, of course, we had to stop. As usual, we were always making jokes to each other to see if we could scare someone. While we were waiting in line, I was joking with the one friend who wasn't in the ghost hunting friends group saying, "Oh, little boy, are you scared to go?" When out of nowhere you hear, "What's the little guy afraid of?" said the cashier. I say little guy because the guys in the group of friends were all very tall, but he was the shortest of them all, and he was a normal height guy about 5 feet 3 inches, but we called him little guy. We explained to the guy and his friend that we were going ghost hunting on a highway, and they simply said, "Oh, that's not scary. If you really want to be scared, go here instead." So we went out shopping from the convenience store, and undecided, we all agreed that we'd better go the new route they recommended, instead of the first route we talked about. So we get there, in the middle of the forest, we notice that there are trees cut down and lying on the sides parallel to the road. We go deeper and deeper into the forest. The darkness is total, and the nervousness is increasing. We approach a monument commemorating a plane crash that occurred there years ago. Absolute silence, total darkness. Only the moonlight illuminated us, apart from the car lights. To scare us a little, we challenged the driver to turn off the lights. Big mistake. So he turned off the car completely. A few minutes passed, and we saw an absolutely enormous shadow, about 2 meters or more, come out from behind the statue and start approaching us slowly. Whatever it was, it had us in its sights. We all started to panic because that thing was getting closer. We started the car and ran away. A bit disoriented, we didn't realize that we were driving deeper into the forest where we had come to a huge sandy opening where there were many paths. We decided it was best to turn around and try to find our way out. As we were doing so, the radio went off with some almost ancient music, and I looked up confused. Seconds later, I see a white face. Not a typical white face, but almost like a Jabberwocky's mask, with 0 expressions. If that makes sense, another guy appeared with a face, and then another, and another. Now, I don't know if it was just us being disoriented and seeing those things, or if this was really happening. We all screamed in unison, "Let's get out of here!" So we sped out of the arena again on the same path where I mentioned the trees earlier. Only this time, on our way back, the trees were not parallel to the road, but actually in the middle of the road blocking our exit. The driver, Mike, in a sports car, tells us to hold on, and he tries to go around the trees on the outside of the road. And luckily we managed to get out of there. Now I don't know for sure if this place is legitimately haunted, or we were set up by the 2 guys earlier in the night, but 2 things are for sure. One is that I'd bet my life that it's a combination of both a haunting and a trap, and 2, that I'll never go back there to find out.